That was a pretty extraordinary development yesterday, and there's been a lot of talk about these two countries potentially clashing. Tom Barrack, when speaking with Israeli media, specifically I-24 News, for those who might not know, we got news yesterday that Israel struck an airport in Syria for the first time in about a year. That airport was reportedly about to be used by the Turkish military to deliver military assets, and some reports suggest Turkish military assets may have already been there. We also got reports that Israel had communicated with Syria beforehand, warning them about Turkish expansion into the country. I've seen satellite images showing craters on the runways. I don't think there were any Turkish casualties or destroyed assets, but that's just based on what I've seen so far. So you might have more information. I'll read Barrack's comments afterward, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this development first.
Well, as far as I know, there were no Turkish casualties. Whether or not there was any equipment there, I have no idea. I think what we need to take away from this is sure, I'm confident that some form of comment or warning was issued, which I'm sure was taken as an insult and ignored, especially in Ankara. But then I also think they waited, watched probably on satellite surveillance. They watched to see the Turkish officers who were sent there to survey the place and evaluate it leave. And after they left, that's when the Air Force came in and demolished the airfield. So that much I think we can say. When this first began, this sort of Turkish Israeli agreement that we crafted in order to promote the dissolution of Syria, in other words, its liquidation and then its resurrection subsequently in the hands of our friends from ISIS. A number of things were discussed, but I said that at the time I thought it was the Middle East's version of the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. That it was a temporary cessation of hostilities. It would not last, and inevitably there would be an Israeli-Turkish war. So I fully expect that that will occur at some point in the future. This is an extraordinarily bad time for Israel to cultivate bad relations with the Turks, because the Turks, despite all of the unkind things said by both sides, have continually transported oil from Azerbaijan through Turkey down past Syria and into Israel. The Turks have also sold billions of dollars worth of goods, especially agricultural products, to the Israelis. So Erdogan had practiced what he does best, which is to talk out of both sides of his mouth. On one side, he was pouring buckets of filth and abuse all over the Israelis for their mass murder in Gaza and their actions in Lebanon. Then he turns right around and essentially does business with them. And this has been a sore point, I think, with a lot of people in the Muslim world. Most Americans are completely unaware of it. I don't think most Europeans care. But I certainly think in the Islamic world, this has not gone down well. But there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. Since then, we've seen lots of cooperation between the Iranians and the Turks to deal with the Kurdish problem. And the Kurds, of course, not all of them, but a large portion of them are exceedingly dependent upon Israeli support, arms assistance, and intelligence. And indeed, we cooperated with the Mossad in a vain hope of stirring up a Kurdish rebellion / invasion of Iran. The Iranians had them targeted, destroyed them, and I don't see much evidence that that's going to happen. And of course, the Turks had no interest in letting that be successful either. So now what? Everyone says, well, Turkey is a member of NATO. Is that really meaningful? I'm not sure that it really is. I think that Erdogan is perfectly willing to stay a member of NATO and wage war with anybody he cares to anywhere in the world. The question is, what do we do about it? Well, we're over a barrel because, of course, President Trump has recently pointed out that one more time that Mr. Erdogan is a personal friend of his, and he has a great relationship with Mr. Erdogan, and things are really great with the Turks. Well, they're not so hot right now. So I don't know what it means short term. I just think long term, it's another indicator that you're going to see a collision between the Turks and the Israelis. And as I say, it's a very bad idea on the part of the Israelis, because in the meantime, you've had this new alignment, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, and everybody has said, well, what's it really about? Well, contrary to popular belief, it's not about attacking Iran. I'm sorry, it is not an anti-Iranian alliance. It has a great deal to do with putting an end, ultimately, at some point in time, to the Greater Israel Project. They're not going to allow that to succeed. So, under the circumstances, you would say the prudent thing for the Israelis at this point is to find a way to avoid any unnecessary collision with Turkey until certainly this issue with Iran is settled. Well, they've chosen not to do that because, well, they're arrogant and they're also completely confident that they have control of us. And they seem to think that in addition to fighting the Iranians, that we could be dragged into a conflict with the Turks as well. And of course, they've also built an alliance system in a sense because they're closely aligned with the Greeks and with Cyprus against the Turks. And they hope that our Mediterranean fleet and whatever forces we have could be employed in that endeavor. Uh, Ultimately, everything's shaping up brilliantly for a much larger regional war, something no one expected.
That's essentially what Tom Barrack said. He told I-24 News that Israel's strike on Syria's Abu al-Duhur airbase risked triggering a direct confrontation with Turkey and Syria. Turkish forces weren't warned about the Israeli aircraft and could have scrambled fighters believing Turkey itself was under attack. He called it serious and worrying, and apparently Washington is now quietly working on a permanent deconfliction mechanism between Israel and Syria, possibly involving Turkey, with a 24-hour coordination center to prevent future misunderstandings. Now, you made an important point earlier, that Erdogan does a lot of business with Israel despite the rhetoric, especially around Azerbaijani oil and Turkish agricultural exports. So, why war? What does Turkey gain? What does Israel gain? They don't even share a border. Is this just about both sides expanding into the vacuum left by the U.S., starting with Syria? And could that lead to a clash?
Well, I think from the Turkish standpoint, privately, they regard Syria as a Turkish province. They also regard most of northern Iraq as a Turkish province. Turkish generals have made it very clear to American generals for many, many years in Iraq during the occupation that, as far as they were concerned, places like Erbil were Turkish cities. And remember that the northern oil fields that we regard as part of Iraq were historically part of Turkey, and the Turks were very angry after World War I that all of that was taken from them. So I think the Turks have a different view of the region from what you're suggesting. And they think that the Israelis are encroaching on them. And the Israelis have threatened openly to take Damascus. And certainly, I'm not sure there's much to stop them from doing so. But remember that when the Turkish foreign minister arrived for his first meeting in Damascus with the new ISIS graduates that have taken over the country, he first went to a mosque where a Turkish sultan is interred. I've forgotten the name of the sultan. This has been a few years ago. And that was a huge signal to everybody in the region who knows anything about the Turks and the history of the region that the Turks were back. That was not an accidental visit. That was a signal to the Israelis that the Turks will not tolerate the capture of Damascus. So I think this whole business is far more serious. Now, they have this new alignment with Saudi Arabia. Can Saudi Arabia compensate for whatever business they may lose with the Israelis? Well, perhaps. Certainly the Saudis have oil and cash. The Turks and the Pakistanis need both. So I'm sure that's part of the consideration. But at some point, you reach a decision where all of these other rational calculuses don't matter anymore. If anyone was rational in 1914, Germany and Russia would never have gone to war. Yeah. Germany and Russia were each other's top trading partners. They had a very profitable relationship. They had a very good national security relationship. Russia and Prussia, Germany, were effectively committed to no aggression against each other, and to the extent they could, to help each other and stabilize. Even Austria-Hungary, to a large extent, fell into that category. But what happened? You got a war anyway. So whatever benefits Turkey accrues from cooperating with the Israelis, which of course involves us because we're anxious to ensure that Israel, Greater Israel, succeeds. So we're the Israeli agent that negotiated the original agreement behind closed doors between Turks and Israelis on how to divide up the region. And obviously, we want the Israelis to have their greater Israel. But that may no longer be acceptable to Mr. Erdogan. He may read the tea leaves differently. He may judge the situation to have changed. And remember, I've always sort of tried to characterize him as a sort of bird of prey that sits on the top of the telephone pole and waits for the roadkill and then goes down and grabs it and devours it. And I don't know to what extent he thinks Israel is approaching roadkill status, but they're getting closer because their country is being not entirely, but certainly substantially destroyed and harmed. And they seem ready to renew the war with Iran that they want to drag us into. So all of these, I think Mr. Erdogan is not going to act foolishly or emotionally or quickly, but I think he's getting closer to the action point.
How significant would it be if Turkey actually gets those F-35s? They're still trying to sell off their S-400 systems to finally get the F-35s they've been waiting years for. Deals Israel has reportedly tried to sabotage. I also wanted to ask about the U.S. nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey, since it's related. I was speaking with a guest who mentioned these particular nukes don't require launch codes. They're essentially just bombs that could be dropped from an aircraft, meaning a Turkish fighter jet could potentially carry and drop one. Do you have more context on that?
Well, I know that I wrote a memorandum that was designed for President Trump that I sent over to the White House while I was in the Pentagon, urging him to withdraw all the nuclear weapons from Turkey. And at the time, I argued that this was a prudent action, that we didn't need them anymore. They were originally placed there for potential use against the Russians. And I think most of them are gravity bombs. I think like the B-61, maybe one of them. I don't remember all the designations, but these are Air Force delivered nuclear bombs that don't need. Well, they're not launched, let us say, as cruise missiles or tactical ballistic missiles. And I thought it was a good idea to get them out because at some point, you might have a decision made at very high levels to take control of them, not for the purpose of using them, but potentially to prevent us or anybody else from getting to them. It's a possibility. I've thought that Turkey's position in NATO has been very fragile for a long time. And I had personally very positive experiences with Turkish officers. I worked with them. I thought they were very professional. I thought the Turkish military was very professional. It was very, very tough, very serious. So I see them as a powerful actor on the ground, certainly in the Middle East. But I just thought it was prudent for us to get those nukes out. Obviously, that never happened. Nothing changed. I think that's unfortunate. But I don't think it's the emergency. Because if the Turks actually need a nuclear weapon, they'll get it from Pakistan. And the Pakistanis have made that very, very clear. That was made clear to us back in 2011. The Turkish General Staff said, look, if we need a nuclear weapon, we don't need you. The Pakistanis have promised it to us. So that's why you're seeing this Pakistani-Turkish Saudi Arabian alliance. They're not just Sunni Muslims. There are other things involved in this. So I don't know. I think it's, this is the kind of thing that when you go to war without having prepared to do so, without having looked at all the consequences, both anticipated and unanticipated, you can provoke a regional meltdown. And I think that's what we're watching. I laugh. I listen all the time to people say, well, when this is over, President Trump has this magic formula. He's changing the architecture of the Middle East. Well, he's definitely changed the architecture, but I don't see any magic formula. And I don't see any future role for us. So that's the problem right now. And I don't think that President Trump is prepared to accept that reality. And I don't think the people around him will let him do that. The Israelis certainly won't, because Israel's whole existence at this point is going to depend on our continual presence and support for them. And if we pull out lock, stock, and barrel, which I'm sure at some point we will do, probably sooner rather than later, they're going to be very unhappy. That's why you've heard these discussions about stationing U.S. forces on Israeli territory.
What's your read on the current standoff between the U.S. and Iran, especially with Iran warning it'll escalate if the blockade continues? Rather than just waiting it out and letting the Americans slowly choke them off, Iran seems to know it has the kinetic upper hand, so they might actually be the ones to strike first.
Well, I think they do have the initiative strategically. They control the high ground, so to say. They're in control of the strait. Somebody said to me, well, we still know that some number of barrels of oil are getting through every day. Maybe one ship gets through. And of course, I'm sure there's a certain amount of graft. If you pay the IRGC enough on the side, I'm sure they'll let you go through with something. But none of that makes up for the loss that we've taken through the closure of the strait. Now, Mr. Trump can talk about how he's in control, and I guess he wants to make that part of the world U.S. territory. I can't wait to see numbers of Americans line up for the purpose of migrating into this new territory and settle it. But this sort of strikes me as being, another Trumpian exercise in self-sodomization. Very stupid. So I hope that they'll drop all this nonsense. But haven't seen much evidence for rationality right now. And the Israelis are in charge. Mr. Netanyahu is in charge, and Mr. Trump is going to do what he wants. So that's why I see another round of conflict coming. It may be the last round, but I see another round coming. And I think that's why you're now hearing these discussions about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Because I think we've sort of reached down to the bottom of the pit for tools and ways to do business. We figured out they don't work. And so somebody said, well, let's go into, door number 2 and see what we can pull out of that. And so there's a discussion about tactical nukes.
Do you think they're genuinely discussing that as a real option? Because that would seem pretty wild to me. I'm struggling to believe they actually are. It just doesn't make sense, even for the most irrational actor. The costs so clearly outweigh the benefits in so many ways, financially for the U.S., reputationally, militarily, and even for Trump's own legacy politically. The list goes on and on. There's very little upside, and it wouldn't even achieve the outcome they want. It's pretty obvious the Iranians wouldn't just collapse because of one tactical nuke.
Well, there was no rationality behind Great Britain's decision to enter the First World War. None. There was no driving issue that compelled them to fight. Economically, it made no sense to them. They were heavily dependent on Germany for a whole range of critical products and chemicals and optics and so forth. No German soldier had shot at a British soldier, as far as I can tell, for hundreds of years. In other words, it just made no sense. On the other hand, the French were an annoyance and a permanent menace. If they'd entered the war to speed the end of the war by threatening the French, then that would have made more sense from the standpoint of British strategic interests. So I don't think rationality has anything to do with it. I don't see any rationality in any of it. First of all, I was reminded the other day that in the official history of the British intervention in the Dardanelles in 1915, it ended by saying that the preparations for the evacuation of the 500,000 British and Allied troops that were in the Dardanelles was infinitely better and more detailed than the preparations for the initial intervention by only 50,000. In other words, 9 months after failure, they leave, but they failed the day they entered. They never had enough troops to do any of the things they wanted to. They grossly underestimated the Turks. That's what we've done. We grossly underestimated Iran. Secondly, we grossly overestimated ourselves. We're a short war force structure. We're designed to go in and fight for a couple of months, not to fight for a year or 2 years or anything else. The Iranians were prepared for the long haul. We weren't. So now what do? Well, that's when you turn to tactical nuclear weapons, at least at the outset, because you think that may be a tool that'll pry open the box and out comes, Iranians ready to surrender and do your will. I think it's absolute nonsense. I see no evidence that if you use a nuclear weapon or not, that these people are going to surrender to you. That's a very dumb idea. But I think it's being considered. Look, Elbridge Colby, who is in the policy side of the Pentagon, has advocated for this. The Air Force and the Navy have always
Elbridge,
liked
Elbridge has advocated for nukes.
for tactical nuclear weapons as something that we could use in future warfare. And so have many of the senior officers in the Navy and the Air Force over many years. I mean, this is why they exist. We started building these tactical nuclear weapons years ago, and it never made a great deal of sense because Colin Powell, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs back in the 1990s, was approached about this because we would run these exercises against the Soviets in Europe. That was usually the standard operation. And then at some point, the war game would end. It usually ended in Central Europe with us being overwhelmed by the vast numbers of Soviet forces. This is in the 80s and the early 90s. And then they said, what are you going to do now? And there was a discussion of, well, we turned to tactical nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. And Colin Powell says, what makes you think that will work? Oh, well, a tactical nuke here, a tactical nuke there, and the Russians will see they can't proceed and everything will stop. And he said, what are you talking about? You mean the Russians are going to sit there and look at you employ a tactical nuclear weapon, see the explosion, the detonation, and say, well, that's a small nuclear weapon. That's not a big problem. Don't worry about that. He said, that's ridiculous. Said they'll use whatever they got against you. Now, we've got a different situation today. I heard somebody come on and talk about, well, we used a nuclear weapon against the Japanese. And people debate whether or not that was needed. That's irrelevant. We did. And they forget something. At that point, Japan was completely isolated. Japan had effectively lost the war. All we did was accelerate the end. Now, what do we have in Iran? Iran's not isolated. In fact, right now, both the Russians and the Chinese are rapidly replenishing stocks of repair parts, equipment, even warheads, I'm told, as well as missile bodies and engines. And they're providing food and medicine and other things. So Iran is not isolated. It has two of the most powerful states in the world as its allies. So what makes you think using a nuclear weapon is going to have any positive effect whatsoever for the United States? All it does is open Pandora's box, convinces everyone that we're completely crazy, that we cannot be trusted. Everybody knows that anyway, but now they'll absolutely conclude that. And the Russians and the Chinese will change many of their policies and approaches. We may well see tactical nuclear weapons used in the near term in Ukraine to finish up the Ukraine war quickly and then close up on the border with Poland. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can happen. We may see nuclear weapons transferred very quietly to the Iranians so that they could use them. Why would you ever do something that stupid? Well, the whole war is pretty damn stupid. It makes no sense. It was never required. So why should we stop at this much stupidity? Let's go full force.